Good evening. We are live on Facebook and to welcome everyone to the first session of Prayer in the Prayerbook, the Siddur as a guide to prayerful reflection. The Siddur contains sections drawn from both the Bible and rabbinic compositions based upon biblical narratives in verse. Our initial focus will be on the Psalms, which are the introduction to prayer and are intended to broaden our thinking about this religious activity. We encourage you to locate the text we're working with in your own Siddur so that you can better relate your experience of learning in this class to your actual experience of prayer. Drusha is committed to a model of Jewish education that is not merely lifelong, but also life-wide and life-deep. While those in our residential programs, such as the summer programs in the United States and at Yeshivat Drisha in Israel, have the opportunity to actively grow together in prayer, we hope that you'll be able to take what comes up in this class into your respective practices, both privately and in your communities. While many of you, of course, have known Rabbi Silber for quite some time, I would like to introduce him for anyone new to our learning community. Rabbi David Silber is the founder and dean of Drisha Institute for Jewish Education in New York and Israel. Rabbi Silber received ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. He is a recipient of the Covenant Award for Excellence in Innovative Jewish Education and is the author of a Passover Haggadah, Go Forth and Learn, and for such a time as this, Biblical Reflections in the Book of Esther. He is also a nationally acclaimed lecturer on the Bible. We ask that those with us here on Zoom, please stay muted unless we are having an open discussion period, in which case, of course, speak up. And if you would be comfortable joining us on camera, we really, really do appreciate the feeling it lends to our learning community to be able to look around and see the other people in the room. Feel free to type questions into the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can post comments below the video and I'll migrate them over here. And to those joining on Drisha Live, hello, good evening. As mentioned before, if you have a Siddur that you love, feel free to find our text in your very own hands, but I will also be sharing text on screen and in links in the chat for your convenience. Without further ado, Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, looking forward to this class, something I've never taught before, so it's always good to explore new things. So the Siddur, the prayer book, which is relatively new. By that I mean, the first Siddur that we actually have is in the 8th century. It's attributed to Rabbi Amram Gaon, even though much of the stuff or piece of it is not actually his, some later accretions. That's actually the first Siddur that we have. It was in response to a question that someone had posed to him about prayer, etc. And it's a Siddur, it's also a manual to prayer. And that's the first major Siddur that we have. Up to that point, prayer is something which is Baal Peh. It's part of Torah Baal Peh. It's the part of an oral tradition, not written down. In fact, there's a statement in the Talmud which suggests that it's forbidden to write down the prayers. And the second main prayer book of enormous significance is that of Siddur Gaon in the 10th century. Those are the two earliest prayer books that we have. And they're very important in terms of the development of prayer, etc., where these prayers are coming from, how old they are, etc. Our focus will be initially on what we call Psukei de Zimra, that is the written from the Bible, biblical citations, which serve as a kind of warm-up to prayer, an introduction to prayer. The term Psukei de Zimra, which is verses of praise, verses of song or praise, that's found in the Talmud. The Talmud has a statement in Masechet Shabbat, Rabbi Yochanan, he says, would that my portion be with those who say Hallel every day. So the Gemara asks the question in Shabbat, Kuf Yud Chet, the Gemara says, what are you talking about? You're suggesting that saying Hallel every day is a positive, but we have another statement, namely, whoever says Hallel every day, is a blasphemer of God. Pretty strong statement, to which the Gemara answers, no, Rabbi Yochanan was not talking about what we call Hallel, but rather he's referring to Psukei de Zimra. There's a difference between Hallel, which is negative, saying every day is a negative, and Psukei de Zimra, which is a good, wonderful thing to do. And what's interesting is that according to most of the commentaries on the Talmud, in terms of what are Psukei de Zimra, it would appear that Psukei de Zimra are essentially 6 psalms. They are, in fact, the last 6 psalms in the book of Psalms. Beginning with Psalm 145, Tehillah David, commonly known as Ashrei, and the remaining 5 psalms of the book of Psalms, which ends with the verse Kol HaNeshama Tarel Yah, Hallelujah. All living creatures, all that have breath in them shall praise God, Hallelujah. Those are the 6 psalms that complete the book of Psalms, and the Gemara calls that Psukei de Zimra, and that's good. But the Hallel, saying Hallel every day, that's no good. What is Hallel? So Hallel is also 6 psalms. Psalm 113, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, 6 psalms. So there are 6 psalms that we call Hallel, and 6 psalms that we call Psukei de Zimra. And the Gemara distinguishes between the two. The recitation of Hallel, which Hal HaMitzri talks of the great miracles, to focus on that every day is a negative, perhaps suggesting that God is only present in the miracle. But the Psukei de Zimra, which talks about everyday occurrences, to say that every day is good. What's interesting for our purposes is that the Talmud calls Psukei de Zimra Hallel. Let's bear that in mind. Psukei de Zimra is called Hallel. Now, Psukei de Zimra is the kind of a warm-up for prayer. The Siddur consists primarily of 2 things. There are 2 things that we have as primary in the Siddur. The first is the recitation of the Shema in the morning and the evening. And when we recite the Shema, there are attendant blessings. 3 blessings in the morning, 2 before, 1 after, 4 blessings at night. Kriya Shema u'birchoteha. That's one big piece of the Siddur. And the second big piece of the Siddur is what we call the Amida, also known as the Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer. That consists of 18, in fact, 19 blessings during the week. And that's the other big piece of prayer of the Siddur. So that's what the Siddur is essentially. And but before we engage in reciting the Shema and the Amida, silent prayer, there is Psukei de Zimra, which at its core is 6 psalms, but over time, there are accretions to Psukei de Zimra. Exactly when these took place is unclear. Since Amram Gaon cites them, it's about the year 740, we can know that many of these accretions, these additions to Psukei de Zimra are very old, even though we don't find them in the Talmud itself, not mentioned in the Talmud. But obviously they're very old, and they may have been recited during the time of the Talmud as well. We simply don't know, but we know they're quite ancient. What I'd like to do this evening is to focus on 2 selections that we have in Psukei de Zimra. Let me say something about the method and the goal of these sessions. Prayer is a difficult thing in the sense, it's difficult for many reasons. One of the big obstacles to prayer is that there are a lot of words. Some people feel way too many words. And it's also the same words, so that we are saying the same thing for those who are, devout in their practice of prayer. It's the same prayers all the time, a little variation. And that, of course, leads to rote kind of behavior. It certainly doesn't help us in terms of reflecting on what is this activity called prayer. So the purpose of these sessions is to suggest a way to look at these texts with a much wider lens, to sort of enrich what we say. The purpose is not to learn how to daven, because I have never met a human being in my life who learned how to daven from hearing a class. That's not the way one learns how to daven. There's only one way to learn how to daven, to the extent we can learn it at all, and that is to be in the presence of people who are davening. Whatever I know about prayer, 99% of it has to do with being around people who actually have a feeling for the davening. And that's not so simple to find those people. I happen to go up with some of those people, and over in my life, I've met a few people who I feel I gained a lot from in terms of understanding this practice we call davening. So it's not in my ability to teach someone to daven. But I will try to enable us to look at what we're saying from multiple perspectives. And what it comes down to essentially is what is known as the intertexts of the Bible, because we have to remember that all prayer, I'm talking about the prayers that we find in our prayer books, in our Siddurim, Machzorim. So the prayers, essentially, what we call prayer in the narrow sense, the Shema Esrei, the Amida, the silent prayer, that is a rabbinic construction. But it's a rabbinic construction, which has been noted by many, is based on various phrases found in the Bible. Virtually all of our prayer, our Amida, Shabbat prayer, the daily prayer, is recalling or citing pieces of verses. And when it cites pieces of verses, it invites us to look more deeply into those verses and to get a much broader and richer understanding of what we might be saying. And in fact, what we might say one day might be different the next day and different the day after, etc. Because the way the intertexts work is that one text recalls another. When you have a string of texts, it is exponential. You can be hearing 16 voices at the same time, and then the trick is to figure out which of the voices you want to give primary significance to. There's always a main line, but there are many other lines since one text plays off the other. But in Psukei de Zimra, it's not about a rabbinic construction of a prayer, because Psukei de Zimra consists of biblical citations. Almost all of the citations in Psukei de Zimra, almost all, are from the book of Tehillim. And even when they're not from the book of Tehillim, and we'll get to one of those, they are ascribed to King David, to David. And in fact, the blessing that we say before Psukei de Zimra, known as Baruch She'amar, says very explicitly, Uv'shirei David Avdecha Na'alelcha Hashem Elokeinu. We are going to praise you with the songs, with the compositions of David. So Tehillim and the words of David, he's the great composer. He's the great musician who is the author of many of our prayers, especially the ones preparatory. He prepares us for prayer. So this evening, I'd like to begin with two selections from Psukei de Zimra. We're not going to complete it, but the idea is to demonstrate a kind of approach. And the two that I have in mind are the following. Now we have to remember that there is the Ashkenazic nusach of prayer and the Sephardic, the Edot HaMizrach. Within these Edot Mizrach, there's more than one way. They're largely the same for the most part, difference of words here and there, but sometimes there's a difference in the order of what they say. Sometimes one group says one thing and another group the other. So for example, the Siddur has essentially four pieces to it, the daily Siddur. It has the blessings that one recites when one wakes up in the morning, together with the recitation of the day of the sacrifices that were brought in the temple. That's the first piece. The second piece is what's called Psukei de Zimra. Those are essentially psalms for the most part. Begins with a blessing in the beginning and a blessing at the end of that. Then you have Shema with its blessings. Then you have the Amidah and the completion of the service. Basically four pieces, the main ones being the Shema and the Amidah. So what are we, after you have the blessings of the morning, rising in the morning, recitation of the sacrifices for those that do that. And then it depends if you have Nusach Ashkenaz or Nusach Sfard. The Ashkenazic order is to recite Psalm number 30, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit David, after which there's the blessing of Baruch She'amar, the blessing on Psukei Zimra, and then following that, there's a prayer that begins with the word Hodu Hashem Kiru B'Shmo. Hodu Hashem Kiru B'Shmo for the first many verses is simply a citation from Divrei HaYamim. It's a citation from the book of Chronicles, Divrei HaYamim. It is David's prayer. I believe it's the first Divrei HaYamim Aleph. It's either chapter 15 or 16. Let me see, I think it's chapter 16. It is chapter 16. It's Divrei HaYamim Aleph, First Chronicles, chapter 16, beginning in verse number 8. And it goes all the way down to verse number 36. And that is what we call Hodu. So the order of the Ashkenaz, I'm leaving the blessing out, is Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, Psalm 30, then the blessing, and then Hodu, from verses 8 to 36. And by the way, Hodu, which is David's composition, he composed it when the ark came to Jerusalem. David brings the ark to Jerusalem. It's not a simple matter to get it to Jerusalem. When it arrives in Jerusalem, according to the chronicler, David wrote this poem, this song, and that's called Hodu. That's the order of the Ashkenazi. The Sephardic Nusach Sfard is a little different. They begin with Hodu. And after Hodu, they have Psalm number 30, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, and after that, they have Baruch She'amar. So Hodu for the Sephardim precedes Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, and for the Ashkenazim, Hodu is later. First Mizmor Shir, and then Hodu. I'll discuss the order a bit. So let me begin with, let's start with Psalm number 30, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit. Now, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit David, Psalm number 30, I will say that it's a stunning psalm. For those who recite it every day, that can get lost. It is truly a stunning psalm. And the question is, for starters, what does it mean? Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit David. A song, here they translate, a song for the inauguration of the temple by David. So they're understanding Chanukat Habayit, the house that's being referred to, according to this translation, is the temple, God's house. Of course, the problem with that, obviously, is that we know that King David didn't build the temple. He wanted to build the temple, but he was told that he cannot build the temple. He may not build the temple. In fact, his son will build the temple. Shlomo builds the temple. So what would it mean that this is a song, David, here they translate by David. Well, let's assume that for now, by David. Upon the dedication, inauguration, or dedication of the temple, David never builds the temple. So what does it mean, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit David? So it could mean something else, actually. It could mean, possibly, that the bayit over here is not the temple, but that the bayit is actually David's house. Beit David, the kingship of David, a song that David wrote when his bayit, when his dynasty was inaugurated, or perhaps when he was told that he will have a dynasty. So which of these two is it? It's very hard to know, but I will suggest that actually it's both. That Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, the word bayit carries with it different significances. It can mean a house, it can mean a dynasty, it can mean a family, it can mean a temple. For example, in the book of Bereshit, Yaakov talks of his family as his bayit. He says to Rabbi, have to care for my own bayit. Means his family. He says to Shimon and Levi, what did you do? You put my family in jeopardy. V'nishmarati ani ubeiti in chapter 34. So bayit has many different meanings. If we look at the book of Shmuel and the story, which has a parallel in Divrei Hayamim, but if we look in the book of Shmuel, for example, chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. In chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, there David says the following. David says, chapter 7, let's find that, 2 Samuel chapter 7. So David has been successful. In chapter 6, David brings the ark to Jerusalem. This is an important point, an interesting point. Chapter 6 in the book of Shmuel, David brings the ark to Jerusalem. He succeeds in bringing the ark to Jerusalem. It doesn't mention in Shmuel that he composed a prayer when he got there. It mentions that only in Chronicles, but the story of the ark coming to Jerusalem is 2 Samuel chapter 6. After he brings the ark to Jerusalem successfully, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, so David says, he speaks to the prophet Nathan the prophet. God has given David respite. David sat in his house. He's in his bayit. And God has granted him safety, respite from all around him. In the second verse, Vayomer HaMelech El Natan HaNavi, Ri'ena, Anochi Yoshev B'veit Arazim. Look here, I dwell in a house of cedars. Fancy house. Varona Elohim Yoshev B'toch Ha'iriyah. But the ark of God dwells in a tent. The Mishkan is a tent. Et HaMishkan Taseh Esi Yiriyot. So David says, doesn't seem right. I'm living in a fancy house, and God is living in a tent. And the prophet Nathan says to David, do whatever you want. God is with you. He assumes that God will, of course, agree that David should build a house for God. But that night, God speaks to Natan and says, go to David and say to him, Ko Amar Hashem, Ha'ata tivne li bayit lishivti. Are you going to build me a house? Question mark. Now, when God has a rhetorical question, typically I would say it is critical, sometimes hostile. The first questions that God asks, first question is Ayeka, to Adam, where are you? Now, God knows where Adam is. But Ayeka is some kind of critique. Where are you means, what have you done? Where you at, man? Means, what have you done? Or Ayeka, where are you? Are you hiding from me? Or Ayeka, how could this happen? It's a critique. And then second question to Cain, where is your brother? Ehevu achicha. Those are critiques. God knows. I don't know where he is. Explain to me you don't know. His blood cries from the ground. So there's a criticism over here on one hand. On the other hand, there's an appreciation of the fact in this chapter that David wants to build God a house. God calls David in this chapter Avdi, my servant, which is a high accolade. So on one hand, there's a critique. On the other hand, God appreciates the gesture or the attempt. What is it about David's idea of building the house that is problematic? What is problematic about it? There could be any number of things that are problematic. God says, listen, if I wanted a house, go tell my servant David, right? Go speak to David. First he says, in all the places that I've always walked, did I ever say to anybody, why didn't you build me a house of cedars? If I want a house, I'll build a house. I don't need you to build me the house. I will determine where and when the house is built. But tell my servant David, listen, I took you from the sheepfold. I made you the king. I've been with you wherever you walked. I gave you a great name, etc., etc. But there's something about David's statement which God finds problematic. I think what's problematic about it is the kind of mutuality. David said to Nathan the prophet, I have a house. Shouldn't God have a house also? I have a fancy house. God lives in a tent. That's not right. Right? And God picks up on that. What are you going to do? You're going to build me a Beit Arazim, a house of cedar? You have a house of cedars. I should have a house of cedars? As if somehow we're on the same plane, on the same level? Are you kidding? You are a nobody, says God. You're a little nobody. I took you from the sheepfold. Whatever you are, I made you. When I want a house, mister, I'll get a house. I don't need you for a house. Furthermore, your house and my house are not on the same plane. That's the critique over here. But on the other hand, I appreciate the thought. You certainly mean well. Maybe it's coming from a good place. It's inappropriate, but it's coming from a good place. But I tell you what I'm going to do, says God in the continuation. I'm going to build for you a house. And there we have the promise in chapter 7 of Beit David. Beit David, I'm going to establish your house, and the one through whom your house is established will also build me a house for my name. If you look at the chapter 7, I'm not going through it now. Maybe we'll revisit this chapter. But in point of fact, here the word bayit has multiple meanings. Here it means dynasty. I'm going to build your house. I'll solidify your kingship. I'm going to build that for you. And that person will build the bayit. That's when I will determine that I want the bayit. And David's response, which is a glorious response at the end of chapter 7, if we scroll down a bit, a little bit further down, keep going. The Ne'eman Beitcha, your house will be firm forever. And then David responds. David's response, which is one of the glorious responses of David in the book of Shmuel. And David said, Mi anochi Hashem Elokimu mi beiti, ki aviyotani ad haro, v'tiktan odzot b'einecho Hashem Elokim, v'tedaber gam el beit avdecha l'mei rachok, v'zot Torat ha'adam Hashem Elokim. So David says before God, who am I, O Lord? And what is my house? You have brought me so far. I appreciate what you've done for me so far. As you said, I took you from the sheepfold. And not only that you've done for me so much so far, but you speak about the future. El Beit Avdecha. You talk about the future. And then David added this very powerful but mysterious part of verse number 12, V'zot 13, V'zot Torat ha'adam Hashem Elokim. This is, here they translate, may this be the law for the people, O Lord God. I'm not sure what that means, may this be the law for the people. I have no idea what the translator meant, but I think it means something else actually here. Zot Torat ha'adam, this is the nature of the human being. That is to say, what is the nature of the human being? David reflects upon himself. Torat ha'adam, as opposed to Hashem Elokim, Torat ha'adam means the human being is limited, finite and limited. You can't have it all. What you can have is a promise for the future. So David accepts, you've done so much for me, and not only that, you've made a promise for the future. And this is Torat ha'adam. This is the most that the human can hope for, is that I can imagine the future. Moshe, who dies at the end of the Torah, sees the land. And that's a great blessing to be able to see the promise. He can't cross over to the other side, but he can see it. So here we have the bayit. Here this chapter plays with the bayit. Chanukat HaBayit, therefore, coming back to our psalm, Psalm number 30, Mizmor Shir Chanukat HaBayit with David, perhaps carries with it both meanings. This is what David composed when he was told these two things about the bayit. What is he told? He's told he will have a bayit, he will have a dynasty. God assures him that David will establish the kingship, or that the kingship of David will be established. And furthermore, that concomitant with that David's line will be instrumental in building God's bayit when God determines that the time is right. So that's the beginning of this psalm, Mizmor Shir Chanukat HaBayit. I would add, by the way, and then I'll stop and take some comments or questions before we continue with this psalm, that what I suggested is problematic about David's statement, namely, I have a house of cedars, so God should have a house of cedars. I suggested that what is problematic about it is a kind of mutuality, as if we're on the same level. I have a fancy brownstone, God should have a fancy brownstone. There's something problematic about that, which God picks up on and critiques David. In contrast to somebody else in the book of Samuel. The book of Shmuel, in contrast, so in contrast is another story. A story familiar probably to most of us. A few chapters later in Shmuel Bet, famous story of David and Bathsheba. David and Bathsheba, so David, there's a war going on, and the soldiers are fighting in the war, and all of David's great warriors are fighting in the battle. Included amongst the great warriors is a man named Uriah HaChitti. David, for whatever reason, stays in Jerusalem. And he sleeps in the daytime, gets up at twilight, goes to the roof, and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. Sees her from the roof. He inquires about her. He summons her. He sleeps with her. Bathsheba sends her away, sends her back home. From his, certainly figures that's, okay, move on, whatever. But she sends him back a message that she's pregnant. And this is a problem. Problem on many levels. I can't get into that now. It's a problem. Both personally and politically, it's a major problem. So David decides he's going to solve his problem without violence. He's going to solve the problem simply by summoning Uriah back home on the pretext of receiving a report about the battle, and send him back home after his report, go back to his wife. Maybe she's been pregnant for a month, we don't know. It's early in the pregnancy. And when the child is born, 8 months later, nobody will know who the father is. And this way, David will solve his problem without violence. The problem is that Uriah refuses to go home. David sends him, go back home, wonderful, wonderful report. I'm so glad you gave me the report, etc., etc. But he doesn't go back to his wife. He sleeps inside the king's palace. And David asks him, I told you to go back home. Why did you not go back home? So Uriah gives his answer. Uriah says to David, says, look, he says, this is found in chapter 11. I'll simply read it to you. Vayomer Uriah David, Ha'aron, Yisrael, Yehuda, Yoshvim, Basukot. He starts with the ark. The ark of God, which was taken to battle, is in a booth, a temporary sukkah. Sukkah is a temporary residence. Not in a bayit. It's in a sukkah. God is living in a sukkah together with the soldiers who sleep in the field. Vani, you want me? Avo el beiti, I should go to my bayit. Is that right to you? I should go to my bayit, but my fellow soldiers are in the field, and the ark is not in its place. The ark was taken to battle. The ark is in the sukkah. I swear I would never do such a thing. That's different than what David said. If I have a house, God should have a house. Uriah said something different. If God doesn't have a house, I shouldn't have a house. And what's interesting is, if you look at the Psalms, this is one of the Shirei HaMa'alot, Psalm 132. Just look for a moment at Psalm 132. Psalm 132 in the Shirei HaMa'alot, we have the following psalm. So Shir HaMa'alot, let's see, Psalm 132, let's find that, here we go. Zechar Hashem David et kol unoto. Oh God, remember David's extreme self-denial. Hashem nishbal Hashem nodar avir Yaakov, who swore to God, the mighty one of Jacob. Im avo bi'oel beiti, im e'aleh al eres yitzuai. I will not enter my house. I will not mount my bed. If I will not give sleep to my eye or slumber to my eyelids. Until I find a place for God. I can't sleep in my house if God does not have a place. And that's actually very interesting because this psalm, oh God, remember David's self-denial. When you read this, of course, what comes to mind immediately, I'm not going to my bed if God is not in God's house. If God doesn't have a place. I'm like, was hardly what David said, but it's exactly what Uriah the Hittite said. The psalmist, of course, ascribes Uriah's statement here to David, or remember David's self-denial. I can't go back to my bed if God is in the sukkah. It's a good example of how the psalmist actually has chosen the story of David, but with a completely different spin. It has David actually in the Psalms speaking in the voice of Uriah the Hittite. Now so I'm going to put this aside for now and simply note for our purposes, and next week we'll continue with this, that actually Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is the ark arriving in Jerusalem, which in Divrei Hayamim is the basis for Hodu. And 7, if I'm correct, is the poem that David composes, I would suggest, upon hearing God's affirmation that there will be both God's house on one hand and David's house on the other. And it's exactly in this order that we are starting our Psuke December, when we enter into prayer. We get up in the morning, we enter into prayer, and we should be thinking about this story, these two stories. And then the question is, in what directions does the story lead us? And it can lead us in a variety of directions. And suddenly this psalm becomes the basis for thinking about a lot of different questions about where we are in life, our responsibilities, our limitations, etc. That's for next week. But for this week, I wanted to focus on something else, on a different intertext for Psalm number 30. Before I do this, which will be the rest of the time, does anybody have a comment or question about what I said so far? I can continue. If you want to speak up, you could please speak up, and we'll, I'll give time at the end to speak. I wanted to, in Psalm number 30, suggest that there is an intertext to Psalm 30, which actually enriches the psalm. Psalm itself is a beautiful psalm. If we were together in a room without the Zoom, another thing that enriches our prayers is actually music. And the best music for prayer is music that brings out the words. The first step in actually appreciating music is understanding what you say. The music can then enrich it. The music can't replace what you say, but the music can enrich it. Music can be interpretive. Oftentimes it's not, because people don't understand what they're saying, and the music has no relationship to what's actually being said. But if we understand what we're saying to the extent of our ability, then the music can be very enriching, give us a different way to see it. But maybe we'll do some singing. I don't know with Zoom if this is possible. But in any event, it's another interest, deep interest of mine. But there is another story here that Psalm 30 recalls. So let's see. Mizmoshir Chanukat Abayit with David. And how does it begin? So it begins with the one in the Psalm speaking. Avomimcha Hashem ki diritani v'lo simachta oivayri. Hashem Elokai shivati elecha v'tirpaeni. Hashem helita min sha'ol nafshi chiyitani miyardi bar. So the one talking in the Psalm speaks about praising or extolling God, ki diritani, literally to draw me out, to lift me up or to draw me out. I've been drawn out. He was in some kind of terrible distress, not clear. perhaps from enemies, for simachta oivai, perhaps from illness, patirpaeni, you healed me. Some kind of distress that human beings face, whether it's illness, whether it's uncomfortable situations, whether it's danger. And it sounds a very dangerous situation because God, you lifted me up out of Sheol, out of the deep, out of the grave. Chiyitani miyardi bar, you gave me life, you healed me, you raised my soul, lest I descend to the pit, to the bar. So it's somebody who has been either in the pit or descending to the pit, the bar, which is also called Sheol, which later on in the psalm is called Shachat. Later on, Ma betza bedami b'ridati el Shachat, hayod cha'afar hayagid amitecha. Right? So Shachat and Sheol and bar. And in reading this, we ask ourselves, where do we have a story of somebody who descends to the pit? Who is it that goes down to the bar? So there is a character who goes down to the bar, who goes to the pit. In fact, this particular character goes to the pit not once, but twice. And this character, by the way, is a character that is similar in many ways to a young David as described in the book of Shmuel. And of course, the character I'm referring to, obviously, is none other than Joseph. Joseph, who is sent by his father to greet his brothers in chapter 37, and the brothers see him from a distance, and they say to each other, the dreamer is coming. Joseph had dreams, and he told his brothers the dreams, how they would be subservient to him, how their sheaves would bow down to his sheaf. And the brothers did not take kindly to this. And we, the reader, are told not only that, he brought back evil report of the brothers to their father. And not only that, he dreams that the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down to him. He puts himself at the center of the universe. And now he's coming to greet them, and they see him from a distance. The dreamer is coming, and they say to each other, let's kill him. Let's kill him, and we'll throw him into one of the pits. And we'll say a wild animal ate him up. And then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Chapter 37. And who speaks up at that point? Reuven. Reuven speaks up. Reuven saves him. Reuven says, we can't kill him. Can't kill him. Lo nakenu nafesh. I have a different idea. Let's throw him into the pit. We'll throw him into the pit. We won't kill him. Let's throw him into the pit. And Reuven says, we are told, thinks, this way I'll later on go and fetch him out of the pit, bring him up from the pit, and bring him back to his father. So Reuven distinguishes between killing somebody with your own hands and causing his death. Because Joseph in the pit will die. Because we're told explicitly there is no water. So Joseph will die in the pit. Reuven tells the brothers that's different than killing him. His intention is a good one, to take Joseph out of the pit. The brothers sit down to eat, not far from Joseph, as we'll see shortly. And they look up and they see a caravan in the distance. A caravan of Yishmaelim, again in chapter 37. And then Judah speaks up. And then Judah speaks up. What does Judah say? What does Judah say? Ma betza ki na'arog et achinu. What profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Right? Let's sell him. Let's sell him to the Yishmaelim. After all, he's our brother. We are killing him. I don't accept this distinction between killing and causing death. We're killing him. Let's sell him to the Yishmaelim. Ma betza, what profit is there? In the interim, however, it would appear another group came by, Midianite traders, vayimshechu vayalu et Yosef min habar, and they drew Joseph up out of the pit. Vayalu et Yosef min habar, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelim, and Joseph ends up in Mitzrayim. Then Reuven goes back to the pit because he hears the brothers want to sell him. He wants to take Joseph out of the pit, but Joseph is gone. And Reuven goes back and says, he's missing. What am I to do? So this is Joseph in the pit. That's one pit. But then we find Joseph in another pit. Where's the second pit? The second pit is Genesis chapter 39, 2 chapters later. That's the story of Joseph in Egypt and the story of Joseph in the house of Potiphar. In the house of Potiphar, where Joseph is tremendously successful, we encounter Mrs. Potiphar. And Joseph sort of has taken over the house. He's in charge of everything. He has a magic touch. And Mrs. Potiphar says, essentially, listen, you've taken everything else. How about me too? And Joseph says, no. That's where he draws his line. I can't get involved with you. That would not be right. It would be a sign of ingratitude. It would be breaking a trust. We can get in more into that some other time. But he says no. And when he says no, he runs away from the house. She's holding his coat, and she tells the people in the house and her husband, look what this guy tried to do. And Joseph ends up in jail. Joseph is in jail. The jail. How does the Torah describe the jail? What is the term for the jail in which Joseph finds himself? There are 3 different terms for jail. One is Beit HaSohar. It's a strange word, sohar. Sohar in Hebrew means something which is round, like a goblet. Might be an Egyptian word. Beit HaSohar is jail. Then we have another word. The Torah says where the asirim are found, those that are bound up, asur, called Beit HaAsirim. Then we're told that 2 of the bigwigs of Pharaoh's court are put in jail. It's called the Mishmar, a holding pen. So there's Asirim, there's Sohar, there's Mishmar. And then Joseph, who interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker in jail. And he tells the butler that you're going to be free in 3 days. He says to the butler, please, when you get out of jail, speak to Pharaoh. Remember me unto Pharaoh. And he says, listen, Ki gunov gunavti me'eret ha'ivrim. Where's that verse? For I haven't, keep going down. Keep going down, keep going down, keep going down. No, keep going down, I think. Yeah, there it is. Ki gunov gunavti me'eret ha'ivrim. V'gam polo asiti ma'uma ki samo oti babar. Where is that? Before, it's before. You went too far. It's in chapter 40. Back. Where is this? Back. No, keep going back. Keep going back. There it is. No, you're right. Tigunov, where is it? You missed it again. Keep going down more. Down.
14.
That's it. Tigunov gunavti me'eret ha'ivrim.
15.
V'gam polo asiti ma'uma kisamo oti babar. Right? They put me in the bar. The jail is called the bar. So Joseph is in the bar in chapter 37. He's in the bar in chapter 39. And he says, it's not right. I was put in 37. It's the Midianites who pulled him out of the pit. And in 39, he asked the butler to get him out of the bar. So Joseph is the one who's in the bar. So when reading Psalm number 30, you're reading about David. But of course, anybody who studied the book of Shmuel knows that the description of the young David and the description of the young Joseph are very similar. They're both people whose brothers don't particularly like them. David's brothers don't care for him. Joseph's brothers certainly don't care for him. They are seen as unimportant. In the story of David, when Shmuel goes to anoint the new king, goes to the house of Yishai in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, and Yishai brings all his children, and Shmuel looks at the 7 children, and God says, not this one, not this one. And then Shmuel says to Yishai, are there any other kids? Oh, there's one more young one. He's out with the sheep in the field. Bring him. It's David. He didn't bother inviting David. And he's the one that God has chosen. And David is called in the book of Shmuel a Ben Zikunim, born to the old age of Yishai. He's a Ben Zikunim. He's not light. And he has a ruddy complexion, does David. It's a kind of effeminate image. When Goliath sees him, he sees he's all red. This is not a fighter, he says. He's Yefei Toar. He's Tovroi. It's the picture of Joseph, actually. So Joseph and David have all kinds of interesting connections. It's easy to not appreciate Joseph when you see him. Sounds like a young braggart. And he may be a young braggart, but he's also a brilliant young braggart. So his dreams will come true, but it's not a simple matter to fulfill the dreams. And when you see David, he's unimpressive. It's easy to misconstrue the David of the book of Shmuel. So there are all kinds of parallels. But here, when we are reading this psalm, in the beginning of our service, we are reading a psalm about David, but we're thinking about the Joseph story. And actually, there are several more references to the Joseph story in the psalm. One of them is about the pit, of course, about being in the pit and about being here in the psalm. The person in the psalm is asking God or reflecting upon the fact that it's God that's taken him out of the pit. Now, in the Joseph story, it's actually what's curious about the Joseph story is Joseph is somebody who never prays, actually. In talking about prayer, the first blessing is traditionally called the Avot, the blessing of the patriarchs. Some people add the Imahot in. I have no objection to that, but it's called the Avot for a reason, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all three of them actually pray, and God speaks to those three. And when you get past Jacob, there's no more prayer. Joseph never prays, Judah never prays, there's no prayers. And God doesn't speak until you come to Moshe, the burning bush. But over here, the psalmist is imagining the one who's being taken out of the pit as praying. And what's interesting is, as we continue to read through this psalm, the next verse is Zamru Hashem Chasidav. So the person in the psalm encourages others to sing and to praise. Ki rega bi apo chayim b'tzono, ba'erev yoin bechi v'raboker rina. The anger is for a moment, it's temporary, but in God's will or desire, there is life. In the nighttime, there is weeping. In the morning, cries of joy. Remember that this is chosen to be the first thing that we say in the morning. The first psalm in the morning in the Ashkenazic rite, the second in the Sephardic rite, Ba'erev yoim bechi v'raboker rina. And I thought, Ani amarti b'shalvi, I thought in my complacency, Ba'al emot li'olam, I would never slip up, I would never fail. Hashem b'ritzoncha hemalato l'harios, and you, God, in your with your will, you have established me as a mountain, established my mountain as a stronghold. When you concealed your face, when you hid from me, hayiti nivhal, I was frightened, I was startled. Eilecha Hashem ekra v'el Hashem et chanan, ma'betza b'dami b'ridati el shachat, hayotcha afar hayagid amitecha. That's the key verse, I think, in the psalm. Interesting is, Eilecha Hashem ekra, God, I cried to you, I pleaded with you. Ma'betza b'dami, what profit is there? What gain is there b'dami in my silence? If I go down to the pit, to the depths, can the dust praise you? Can it speak of your truth? And what's interesting is, if we recall the story of Joseph, remember the story of Joseph when the brothers are in Egypt? Remember? Joseph recognizes his brothers, chapter 42. He recognizes the brothers and he speaks to them harshly. And he says, you are spies. You've come to spy, which apparently comes with the death sentence. And he puts them in jail for 3 days. They decide to take one as a captive. And when the brothers hear these accusations, what do they say to each other? The brothers said to each other in chapter 42 of Genesis, Reshit 42, Avol Ashemim Anachnu Alachinu. They see what is happening to them as payback for what they did to their brother. Now, why they see it this way, I can't get into now. There's a limit. I can't get deeply into Joseph's story. That's how they see it. What did they do wrong in the Joseph story? Asher ra'inu tsarat nafsho. We saw his suffering. Pitchanano eleinu, when he pleaded with us, v'lo shamanu, and we paid no heed. Pitchanano eleinu v'lo shamanu. Right? And over here, what does the psalmist say? Elecha Hashem ekra b'el Hashem etchanan. Right? Shema Hashem b'chaneni. Hashem eyeh ozeri. It exactly plays off what the brothers did not do when Joseph pleaded with them. It's interesting, in chapter 37, when Joseph is in the pit, the Torah never said that he pleaded. It doesn't say a word about Joseph in the pit. It says there's no water in the pit, where they're eating a festive meal a few feet away. But we don't hear Joseph's cries in chapter 37. But in chapter 42, when the brothers reflect upon their own misfortune, and they connect it to the Joseph story, what do they recall? They recall he cried out to us for help. Hitchanano, but we paid no attention. Now, it's actually very interesting what people remember or what people do. You know, I'll give you an example from a story I cited earlier. Story of Uriah Hachiti. You read the story of Uriah Hachiti. Okay, David, for whatever reason, doesn't go to war, stays home, bored to tears, walks the walls, one might say, gets up towards the evening, walking on the roof, sees this gorgeous woman, summons her, sleeps with her, sends her home. From his perspective, it's over. And then, it's okay. Then she's pregnant. He tries to solve his problem peaceably, doesn't work. And then he has Uriah killed. He murders Uriah. How does he murder Uriah? What does he do? Well, he sends Uriah back to the battle, right? He had summoned him on the pretext of finding information about the war. He couldn't care less about the war. That's not on his mind at all. And he hands Uriah a sealed note, knowing that Uriah will never open it, being the noble man that he is. And the note, essentially, we can summarize it in 2 words: kill me. He hands him the note. When you read the story, what's funny is, not that it's a funny story, but what actually bothers us very much in the story, I think, I'll speak for myself, isn't so much the murder and the adultery that is a problem. But the adultery was a crime of passion, and he doesn't want to kill Uriah. I'm not justifying it. But giving him his own death sentence, handing him the note, knowing he's never going to open. What kind of person does that? What kind of animal behaves that way? That's what it is. Where does it say you can't do it? What's the Avera? Lo tirtzach I got. Lo tinaf I understand. But often what actually speaks volumes more than the actual crime, which somehow is a crime of the moment, a crime of passion, but the idea of giving him the note. And it's interesting over here, what they remember is not throwing him into the pit, in which he will die. Let's be clear about that. Joseph, if they don't, throwing him in the pit means he dies. Yes, Reuven intends to save him, but they don't know that. They're not killing him with their own hands. He'll die after a few days of starvation. There's no water. He'll die in the desert, a terrible death. And they're sitting a few feet away past the caviar, What they remember is something else. He cried out for help and we didn't respond. Can you imagine you're sitting and a few feet away, people are crying. They're crying for food. They're crying for help. And they see themselves dying and you're sitting there and just eating vayeshu lecho lechem. That's what they remember. So that's recalled over here. Shema Hashem v'chaneini Hashem eyeh ozeri. And of course, the psalmist turns to God and says, Ma betza b'dami b'riditi oshachas. It's actually quite brilliant. Ma betza is of course what Judah said. But notice that the psalm plays off something else, which is what Yehuda said in the story famously is, Ma betza ki naharog et achinu v'chisinu et damo. What is profit if we kill our brother and cover up the bloodshed? Damo. Reuven had said, Al tishbechu dam, don't shed blood. In the psalm, the word dam isn't blood. Ma betza b'dami b'riniti el shachat. What profit is there b'dami, in my silence? In my silence. The grave is the place of silence. Ma betza b'dami b'riniti el shachat. What is the benefit in my silence? Hayotcha offer hayagid amitecha shema Hashem v'chaneni Hashem hayei ozeri. So God chaneni, be gracious towards me. Be gracious towards me. Be my helper. And the psalm finishes with 2 verses. Then I'll take questions and have a final comment about this psalm. You have transformed Mispeida's eulogy or mourning to rejoicing, to dancing. Pitachta saki vatazreni simcha. Pitachta saki, you have loosened saki. What does saki mean? Saki is sackcloth. It's what you wear in mourning. Sak is what you wear in mourning, right? Vatazreni, you girded me with joy. You dressed me with joy. You took off my sackcloth and you dressed me with joy. And what's interesting is, who is the character who's constantly changing his clothing? Who is the person? Joseph. He starts with the ketonet pasim, and the brothers take that away from him and dip it in blood. So Joseph lost his ketonet pasim, his multicolored or his long-sleeved coat, the sign of his prominence. And then he goes, we find him in Mitzrayim, and he's wearing a different coat, right? And Mrs. Potiphar confronts him. And Joseph runs out of the house, but she's holding on to his coat. So he has his coat. And she shows the people, look at the coat. Look what he left of me. He's teasing me. He's mocking me. She shows her husband, and he ends up in jail. And then Joseph asks the butler, get me out of this bar. Get me out of this pit. And the butler forgets him 3 days later. But 2 years later, he remembers him. And Pharaoh summons him from the jail to interpret his dreams. And what does Joseph do before he leaves jail? Vayigarach vayichalef simlotav. He changes his clothing. That's the 3rd time. And then he stands before Pharaoh and interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And what does Pharaoh do? He dresses him in the royal garments. Joseph is constantly changing his outfit. And the outfit is, whether it's the multicolored coat, the sign of the prominence of Joseph in the family. And then, of course, it's the house, working in Potiphar's house. And then it's the meeting with Pharaoh. You change the garments you wear in jail. And then, of course, the garments of the viceroy, together with the ornaments and the ring and the necklace. It's interesting that Joseph never regains his old clothing. He always gets new clothing. It's the person who can adapt to the new situation, as opposed to Judah, for example. In the intermediate chapter, Judah and Tamar, he gets back the same clothing. Judah is able to recover his past, actually. Judah is able to, because Judah repents. So Judah is one who's able to regain his past. And Joseph is different. Joseph doesn't regain the past. Joseph, maybe until the very end, is one who adapts to the new situation. He's able to adapt to the situation. So the psalmist says over here, Pitachta saki vatazreni simcha. You gave me a new set of clothing. You took my sackcloth off. Once again, the reader of the psalm is thinking about Joseph the whole time. Vatazreni simcha, the ability to adapt to a new situation. So therefore, you have given me life. Given me life means I have not been consigned to silence. That's what the first psalm is about, the ability to speak, the ability to communicate. And now the question is, towards what end? And the last verse of the psalm, which for the Ashkenazim is the first part of Psukei de Zimra, and we'll get to Hodu next week. In order, for the purpose of, to sing about your glory and not be silent. Hashem Elokai v'yolam odeka. Oh God, I will praise you forever. The idea, it's interesting about prayer. What is the basic idea of prayer? So Rabbi Soloveitchik, who spoke a lot about prayer, actually, spent a fair amount of time talking about prayer. He always emphasized, and this is based on the Rambam, and it probably is the case, that is what the Rambam thinks. He saw prayer fundamentally as requests, as bakasha. The prayers basically are requests of God, things that we need. And the Amidah, if we get there, maybe this is going to be a year-long course, by the way. We're going to meet till Thanksgiving, a small break afterwards to do a section on Shemitah, and then the whole spring, hopefully, that's my hope, my prayer, that we'll be able to explore this fully. I'm not sure we'll do it in a year, but something I think can be very helpful in prayer, enriching, and get us to think about this activity. So, but the psalmist in this psalm has a different idea about what the purpose of prayer is. It's very clear. The purpose is to sing God's praises. Now, what exactly that means is a good question. I'm not going to be silenced. I'm going to sing God's praises. Let me just have one small reflection upon this, and I'll take comments and questions. And that is that the story of Joseph, actually, which is being recalled over here with the Mabetza, with the Dami, with the Shema Hashem B'Chaneni, which is Pitachta Saki, which is the bar. All these references to the Joseph story. Actually, when you hear it, it's obvious, you know what I mean? After you hear it, it's obvious. It's not obvious before. But it wasn't obvious to me before. I began to think about this, you know? And you're recalling the Joseph story, and you're recalling the David story in the context of the Joseph story. And the story about Joseph is actually very interesting, because the truth of the matter is that the things that happened to Joseph, which are very negative, your brothers throw you into pit in which you will die. Let's see what happens to the dreamer, right? And then he ends up in Egypt, in the house of Potiphar. And then he ends up in jail. And he begs the butler, remember me unto Pharaoh. I did you a favor. I gave you the good news. You're going to survive. You're going to make it. You're going to be restored to your post. Do me a favor. Mention me to Pharaoh. He forgets him 3 days later. But in truth, if you think about it, if the butler had remembered him 3 days later, okay, maybe Joseph gets out of jail. Maybe he ends up someplace else. And we never hear from Joseph again. But he didn't. Joseph's in jail. So when Pharaoh says, I had bad dreams, so the butler said, there's some kid in jail, some Jew boy in jail. Nar Eved Ivri. Some kid, some Jew. But you know what? He interpreted my dreams and the dreams of the baker, whom he said is going to die. Because interpreting the butler's dreams is no trick. Because if the butler survives, he's happy. If the butler dies, he's dead. But to tell the baker he's going to die, that's a risk already. What if he doesn't? He won't be very happy. So Joseph that's what the butler remembers, not just me, but the baker. Oh, hurry him out of the jail. So all the negatives, in other words, ironically, the brothers throwing him into the pit is what allows the dreams to come true. Being taken to Egypt, the viceroy, all his dreams about power through controlling the economy. That's Joseph's dream. That's possible in Mitzrayim. How did he get there? They threw him in the pit. Looking back at his life then and seeing all these negatives, but at the end of the day, they were all necessary components which allowed Joseph to end up where he ends up, which is the second most powerful person in the land of Egypt. Now, it's more complex than that, but my point is that's one way to think about the Joseph story. So at the end of the day, I am grateful for every step along the way, not just the positive steps, but those things that at the time were very negative in my thinking, because I didn't really understand. I thought what it means is you have no problems. As the psalmist said, I thought I'll never slip. And I didn't realize that the slipping is also part of the process. The slipping is also important. I recognize now, looking back at it, that the slipping, the setbacks, were part of what enables me to be successful. And I'm grateful not just for the positives. Perhaps one can read it. I'm even grateful for the setbacks, because through those setbacks, I was able to arrive at a good place. At the time, I didn't necessarily realize that. But now looking back at it and thinking about the past and trying to get a take on my own past, I realized that even the setbacks were positive. I want to make one more point about this psalm. It's one of the great psalms, actually. We take these things for granted. There are a lot of great psalms. But I have a question that's been bothering me for a while, and I want to raise the question. In recalling the story of Joseph, I wonder whether we are primarily supposed to recall it from the standpoint of Joseph, or whether we are invited to recall it primarily or also from the standpoint of the brothers. Because after all, Mabetza is uttered by the brothers. Histarta panecha hayiti nivhal. You hid your face from me, God. I was nivhal. I was startled and frightened. When Joseph said, I am Joseph, they couldn't speak. So I wonder about whether the psalm is not just inviting us to see it from Joseph's standpoint, but also to see it from our own standpoint, our own mistakes, our own treatment of the other, to see how we have behaved towards the other. And at the end of the day, we mistreated this person who at the end of the day was central to our own growth and our own survival. At the end of the day, it's Joseph and Joseph's dreams, which actually sustain the family and sustain a good part of the world, whether you like the guy or not. And most people don't. But that's not the point. The point is not to judge someone negatively just because you dislike him, and there may be good reasons to dislike him, but to try to get a deeper picture of the other and perhaps to see it in a more generous light. Maybe that's also what the psalmist invites us to do by recalling the story of Yosef. Now, we just say what the plan is, and I'll take comments and questions. But I mentioned that this Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit begins, the first line of it recalls actually chapter 7, recalls the Bayit, recalls the promise to David that his line will build the house of God, and that David himself will have a Bayit. And that follows upon chapter 6, which is the bringing of the ark to Jerusalem. And Hodu is, of course, the prayer that David composes when the ark comes to Jerusalem. So next week, I wanted to talk about the ark coming to Jerusalem as preliminary to David building the house. What we recall in our prayers, the Nusach Sfard is perfect. It has Samuel chapter 6 before Samuel chapter 7. But even in the Ashkenazic rite, the first two things that we are saying are a text that recall chapter 7 of Samuel and a text that recall chapter 6. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why did the composers of the Siddur want us to begin by thinking about these two stories? So that will be an invitation for next week, but I'm happy to take comments or questions now. By the way, if there's more questions or you think of something afterwards, you can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org. dsilber@drisha.org. But if you have comments or questions now, I'll be happy to entertain a few.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
So it is true that in the text, Yosef, we don't see Yosef praying, but here in the Mizmor, he is recalled and there is someone who is praying. So is the psalmist, or could we say that the psalmist is commenting on the Yosef story and saying he did pray?
That's certainly possible. That's certainly a possibility. I think within the Hasidic masters, I think some say we are praying all the time, whether we are voicing it all the time or speaking directly to God or to God's agents in this world. But one way to see it is that in some deep sense, our souls are actually crying out. Or it could be that what the Midrash faults Joseph for is that it said that God does all the chesed for you in the house of Potiphar. And whom do you approach to help you? The Sarah Mashkin. This is basically a bomb, basically. The Sarah Mashkin, this is the person you turn to. Don't you realize I've been helping you all along? So that actually suggests that in the plain reading of the Torah, that for whatever reason, Joseph does see himself as beholden to God. He says to Mrs. Potiphar, it will be a sin against God. That's for sure. But when it comes to asking for assistance, he sees it more in terms of looking to the human beings, to my society, to my fellow human being or whatever, to help me out. He pleads his case with the Saramashkim. The Saramashkim is not terribly impressed. And actually, the Saramashkim only saves Joseph when it helps the Saramashkim. When he can ingratiate himself, then he remembers. But to do him a favor, no. But what you say is certainly a possibility, that an interesting possibility, that the psalmist is kind of reinterpreting the story. As the psalmist reinterpreted David in Psalm 132. It wasn't that I have a house, you should have a house. It's that I can't sleep till you have a house. I'm not going to my bed to God has a house. I'm staying up all the time. That's the psalmist in 132. In the book of Samuel, that's Uriah Hittite. That's what Uriah says. And of course, it's part of the critique of David, all kinds of critiques. He should have walked over to Uriah, kissed him on the head and said, you're so right. And you said it better than me, actually. I said, well, you said much better. But that's not what happens. Eventually, he has him killed. So, but your point is very well taken. But my point over here, and I'll take other comments, of course. My point is that this approach does two things. First of all, it deepens our understanding of the Bible. Let's start with that. I think the interpretations, I mean, I love my interpretations, but of course I'm an Ogea Baduffer. But the point is, but more than that, these texts come alive and suddenly you can say the same psalm 10 days in a row with 10 different thoughts. And it's all there actually. It's like great music. There's a main line. There's a main, I mentioned recently, I was listening to Chopin, which I love very much. Rubinstein and Horowitz playing Chopin. They're both amazing. And they're completely different. And the notes are the same, actually. They're bringing out something different in the music. They're both great, and they're different. And that's the way these biblical texts work. With the intertext, you hear a lot of things, and it's all there. It doesn't displace the main line, but it's there. And all of these associations are there, and they're an invitation for us to think about today, when I read this, what am I thinking about? And it's actually there. So it's a way to enrich. After all, let's face it, saying the same stuff every single day is highly problematic, to put it mildly. I'm not dealing now with a way to solve that problem with prayer. That's a different conversation. And I would have some people might think radical thoughts about that, but let's leave that out. But even in terms of what we are saying, to be able to look at it from a variety of perspectives. Now, the more comments. Alan, you had something to say?
Yes, when you mentioned Reuben going to the pit and not finding Joseph there, well, since I spent much of my work life in Christian hospitals, I immediately thought of the disciples going to Jesus's crypt and finding the bones not there.
Right.
Right, and so certainly in Christian spirituality, there's a strong sense of identification with Jesus going down the Vale of Tears and identifying with Jesus' suffering. And if you accept that form of spirituality, it does give tremendous notion of redemptive suffering. It gives meaning to a person's suffering, which is less emphasis within our own
There's no question.
There, though.
You made actually several very important points, which require more time. But look, the truth is, if you have a God who actually walks amongst you, it's easier to relate to that in terms of suffering. If there's a movie that we screened at Drisha many years ago, one of my real favorites called Winter Light, if anybody remembers Winter Light. And the movie, I don't want to give the movie away, but the point is that it's a great Christian, one of Bergman's, I think, his best movie. And it's about somebody whose disciples at the end of the day don't actually understand what he's teaching. At the end of the day, because they're all asleep, he says, I've taught for so many years and no one really understands the message. And that is part of the suffering, when you try to get across your ideas and that you're not being understood. And that's coming into a world to try to redeem it, but those who are to be redeemed, and even the ones closest to you, don't really get it. So I think that's how Bergman interpreted that story. But I think redemptive suffering is very much in Christianity. I think it's there in Judaism too, but it's clear, it's much easier to access, I think, in Christianity. I think that's an important point. Of course, Reuben going back to the pit is, of course, makes it obvious that the brothers never sold him. Because if the brothers had sold him, as some of the Midrash and Rashi claim, what do you mean the boy is missing? Of course he's missing. We sold him 10 minutes ago. What do you mean he's missing? So the Midrash comes up with solutions, but the plain meaning is they didn't sell him. They meant to sell him. They're responsible for the sale, but they didn't actually sell him. Okay, when you see the comment that you made deserves more attention, but I'll have to leave that for now. There was another question as well, I believe. Someone else? Please speak up.
I was more of a comment about
Yes.
the critique of what was the critique against David? I thought maybe there was some kind of implication that God needs a larger house, as if that will contain him. There's a sense of contain. What do you mean your house? We need house to contain us, to protect us. And it seems to me that David is making a parallel between our human needs and God's needs, in that God needs a larger house.
That's a good point, actually. That's a good point. It wasn't the point I was making. I was making it.
I know. I'm making
it. It's a good point. The question you are raising is generally a very good question. And actually, King Solomon himself said it when he dedicated the temple. He said exactly what you said. The heavens can't contain you. How can this house contain you? Now, King Shlomo's answer to the question was, you're not actually in the house. The house is a gathering place for the prayers that go to heaven. That was Solomon's solution. That's a very important point that you've made. I made a different point.
Yeah.
I have a house, you should have a house. If we're on the same level. What do you mean? What do you mean? And God's response is, I appreciate it. You are a faithful servant, but let's remember who you are and who I am. I am God, and you are nobody. You're a little nobody. I took you from the sheepfold. Whatever you are, I made you. Don't forget that, my friend. And says David, amazingly, and you're so right. You're so right, says that. David's response is perfect response. I have nothing to say. You've been good. You've done so much till now. And not only that, you make promises for the future. That's amazing, actually. That was David's response. Glorious response. Okay, I take one more comment and then we'll have to stop for this week. We continue next week. Does anybody else have a comment? I thought there was one more comment. Last word, anyone? Okay, so we'll stop then at this point. Okay, looking forward to next week. Next week, we'll take a look at Hodu. And then we'll move forward with Psuke de Zimra. Then Mizmor Latoda, Ashrei, a couple of the Mizmorim for Shabbat. And that'll be until Thanksgiving. And then the Shemitah cycle, the covenant. And then we'll start with Shema, the blessings, and the Amidah. That should be extraordinarily interesting, but the Amidah especially. So that's something which is looking forward to that. Okay, Noah, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. And as always, thank you, Rabbi Silber, for, I'll call this one a powerful class because I'm feeling that and looking around at other people's faces. I think that a lot of people are going to be looking at this psalm differently the next time they visit it, tomorrow probably. And of course, thank you to all of you here who joined us on Zoom and Drisha Live and on Facebook for being part of Drisha's learning community. It is the community that makes Drisha what Drisha is. This week is just the very beginning of our autumn programming cycle, and we have a full slate of classes lined up, very full, including 7 that engage with the theme of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, from a variety of lenses and angles, including courses that focus on Mishnah, Gemara, philosophy, ethics, contemporary thought, and more. You know, whatever you're into, and if we missed what interests you most, let us know. You can find out more about those programs on our website, www.drisha.org. The link is in the chat, and you are encouraged to share widely. Have a wonderful, wonderful night and a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you all.